Reis je vaker dan 1 keer per maand? Dan kun je al voordeliger uit zijn met NS Flex DAL-voordeel. Hiermee reis je met 40% korting in de DAL-uren. Probeer nu 3 maanden voor maar €2,50 per maand. NS Flex is het abonnement dat met je meebeweegt. Kijk voor de actievoorwaarden op ns.nl/reisflex.
This is episode 52 of Paranormal Stories. This week the book I'm going to be reading from is called My Most Memorable Psychic Readings and Personal Stories by Barbara Bandel. As you may know, I produce 2 podcasts, the Past Lives podcast and the Alien UFO podcast, and it's here that I can bring them together. When I have guests on my podcasts, I read their books to work out questions for the episodes, and when reading these books I always find such fascinating information that never makes it into the podcast. And here I get a chance to give you a peek into the book. I've put links to this book in the show notes, and I did seek permission to record this extract from the author, and she kindly said yes. And if you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review and be sure to subscribe. So I'm going to read from the first chapter. This is called Love Beyond 9/11, and this is what Barbara has written. Out of the blue, he was standing in front of me again, the charming Dutch fireman in his uniform and friendly smile. I was busy with the flow of my day, and just like his previous unexpected visits, he caught me off guard. On earlier visits, he had not said anything to me. He always smiled at me, put his fire helmet on with great pride, and then disappeared again after a few seconds. But this time it was different. He started to talk to me. He said his first name. I smiled and said, "Hi, nice to meet you again." We spoke to each other using our minds. This is how deceased people communicate with me. I was delighted he said something after so many visits when he did not say anything to me. There are people who we meet for the first time and we like them instantly. With spirits, it works precisely the same. I remember his first visit very well and how I felt an instant click with his energy. I felt at ease with him. He was very likable. I could feel he was a loyal and honest man, kind and caring. Someone who made people feel good about themselves. His smile was genuine. I guessed he was in his 30s, and I found him handsome and charismatic. Every time I saw him, he brought a smile to my face. I could sense how proud he was to have been a firefighter. He always wore his uniform. I can also say that he was a very patient man, patient and persistent. When we first met, I had no idea how patient he had to be with me. I was clueless about his plan. Ever since his first visit, I've been waiting for somebody close to him to book a psychic reading to connect with him. Maybe his partner or one of his children. I was convinced that someone would contact me because spirits often visit me days or weeks before the reading occurs. I think they do this to discover the best way to communicate with me before the psychic session starts, because every psychic medium works differently. Maybe they are curious about who I am and want to sense my energy. Spirits speak the language of the medium. I was born and raised in the Netherlands, and most of my clients are Dutch. I, therefore, automatically assumed that this charming firefighter was Dutch too. I remember being a bit confused about the situation, because he paid me brief visits for many months. Still, no one came for a session about him, and I did not understand why. I felt he left such an enormous void after he died, and it made no sense that he would come to me for no reason. I decided not to worry about it. Maybe his partner or relatives needed more time to be emotionally ready for a psychic reading. I did not have much time to overthink things. I was a single mother of 2, and my practice was busy and always booked for months ahead. I was up and running when I woke up until I went to sleep. After many months, without saying a word, the fireman suddenly started talking to me. He said 2 or 3 sentences during each visit, and I always had a pen and paper somewhere at hand to avoid forgetting a single word he'd said. I thought that when someone connected to him would come to my office for their reading, I would hand him all the notes. Every time he talked to me, he always ended with the same sentence: "Tell my wife how much I love her." And my answer to him was always the same: "Yes, I will tell her, I promise." I do not give a promise easily. When someone asks me to keep my promise, I always think about whether I really can keep this promise or not. Giving my promise to someone is something I take very seriously. The firefighter never asked me for my promise. I gave it myself. I knew someone would eventually come for a reading, so my promise was a no-brainer. But little did I know what he would ask me months later. In the following months, he gave me information in bits and pieces. He told me about his life and his children. He had specific information he wanted to say to them, and I wrote everything down. He talked about how he helped several colleague firefighters who had died the same day to help and explain what had happened, and they were now deceased. Some of them were confused about where they were all of a sudden. I can imagine that seeing his familiar and kind face explaining what had happened to them made them calm. He told me how quickly everything happened and how he thought he would be home in time for dinner that day. He said he had lived in New York, and I was still convinced he was Dutch because Dutch people live worldwide. One day, when he paid me another visit, everything fell into place for me. It turned out that he was not Dutch, nor was his wife. I understood everything he had told me the minute he had said he got killed on September the 11th in one of the Twin Towers. I was in shock and utterly speechless for minutes. All these years he gave me bits and pieces of information about 9/11. I did not connect the dots because I thought he was a Dutch firefighter who had died while working in the Netherlands. Not in a million years would I have guessed what he was talking about until he got explicit. Like billions of people, I still know exactly where I was and what I was doing at that moment when the horrific news started coming in. I could not stop crying when I watched the news that day. These images are imprinted in our memory forever. I told him how incredibly sad and sorry I was that he died on that black day. I asked him, "Why did you not say this right from the start, that you died in New York while doing your work on 9/11? His answer made it crystal clear that he knew me very well and probably knew me long before I became aware of his presence. He answered, "I know you have trust issues. You would never believed me if I had told you about 9/11 right from the start. You would have thought you made it up, that I was a weird trick of your mind, and then I would not have had any chance to connect with you anymore. I could not let that happen." His description of how I would have acted was so accurate. I would not have trusted what I heard and saw. He could not have known this unless he knew beforehand how my mind worked. He knew exactly how to approach me and how to build trust. Before he told me about 9/11, I had often thought of his wife and how difficult and painful it must have been to live without him. Men like him are rare. His love for her was and is so intense. For many years, before I went to sleep, I asked my guides to help her. After her husband told me about September 11th, my heart went out to her even more. I cannot imagine what it must have been like for her, her children, his family, and everyone who loved him. After a few days, he revisited me when I was no longer in shock. I was glad he did because I wanted to ask who was coming for a reading to connect with him. I was still convinced someone would come to my office, but he said, "I want you to contact my wife and tell her everything I told you." Before I could say or ask anything, he was gone. He left me staring at the wall, wondering how on earth I was supposed to find her. I did not even have a last name, and besides, what was I supposed to say if I ever did find her? I felt I could not email her and just barge into her life, saying I was in contact with her late husband. I said this aloud, hoping that he would hear me and that he would not ask me to do this. What if I tore up a wound? I felt very responsible for her and her well-being. The last thing I wanted was to upset her or, even worse, break her heart. Even the thought that I might cause her pain brought tears to my eyes. But then I thought, what if the information from her husband might help her? Because I could not believe that her husband spent so much time and effort visiting me for no reason, he probably knew very well that I could be a tool to reach his wife. After long consideration, I decided to find her. Hello listeners, this is Simon. Now, as some of you know, I have a diploma in clinical hypnotherapy and I'm certified in past life regression therapy. And in the past few weeks, I've taken many clients through some amazing and healing past life regressions. And I conduct sessions over Zoom, and I've had clients from many countries around the world. Now, when you go through a past life regression, you will feel totally in control and remember everything. And also, I record the whole session and send you an MP3 afterwards. And this gives you space to relax and go with the flow, knowing that you can listen back later and analyse what you experienced if you need to. So if you ever wanted to explore your past lives in a single session or have an issue you want to work on, you can go to my website at pastliveshypnosis.co.uk and book a free 20-minute consultation. And at the moment, I'm offering a 25% discount to everyone that has signed up to the Patreon campaign. The link is in the show notes. Okay, so the book I read from this week is called My Most Memorable Psychic Readings and Personal Stories by Barbara Bandel. And if you want to buy the book, there is info and links in the show notes. A great way to support the podcast is to sign up on Patreon. On Past Lives Podcast Patreon, when you sign up for $5 a month, you get an extended episode every week. And for $2 a month, you get an extended episode every month. There's also a $12.50 Patreon tier, where every week you can get an extended episode of Past Lives Podcast and the Alien UFO Podcast extended episodes. Just go to patreon.com/Past Lives Podcast, or click on the button on my homepage at pastliveshypnosis.co.uk. And there is a Past Lives Podcast Facebook group, and if you'd like to join, you'd be very welcome. And if you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review, and be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or via your favourite podcast app to make sure that you don't miss out on any episodes. And thanks for listening.
Luister nu naar Ongeboren Leiders, een podcastserie ter ere van 75 jaar De Baak. Met leiders van nu praten we over morgen. Met hen bespreken we de vragen: wat voor leiders gaan we de komende 75 jaar nodig hebben? En dat hoor je in Ongeboren Leiders van De Baak.
In deze koelere tijden is een nieuw type mens ontstaan. De warmtejagers. Die vinden altijd simpele manieren om energie te besparen. Met een comfortabel IKEA-pleed voor op de bank bijvoorbeeld. Zo worden de koudste dagen de warmste. IKEA, een wereld aan ideeën.